Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism, the midweek special. Nice to have you. I hope you and yours are well. As you know, at the weekend, probably as we announced and I said in my blog and we said at the start of the Prism show at the weekend, that one of the most eventful things that's happened since the referendum is the Salvo liberation move at the United Nations, and hence we had Alf Baird on, who, and I know a lot of you enjoyed it, and it was very enlightening. It was great to have Alf, but we thought we needed more, and we thought you needed more, and so it is my absolute pleasure to welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism, Sara Saylers. How are you, Sara? Nice to see you again.
Thank you. Tired but well, thank you.
Well, you should be. This is a very exciting time for you.
It really is. It's you have to stop, and for so long it was don't look down, and then to get to that point, and it took so much work, and so much stress, and then you go, we've got to this point, and now this is actually the start. So all this, the last 2.5 years has been about getting to the starting line and wondering if you ever would, and now we are. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, I actually said to Alf at the time, I just remembered back to when you and I were at the Hampden Park, and you made your first, if you like, your entry into the big world and made your speech, and it wowed people then. But it's been a long haul, a lot of cul-de-sacs, a lot of barriers, a lot of disappointments. Congratulations, you've got it to this far. I have to say that even old, me, I'm the cynic, and didn't think you'd get this far. So I stand corrected, and I doff my hat, madam.
Thank you
for your efforts and the efforts of all the people within Salvo. It must have been tremendously, as I say, proud moment for you. You've had ISP in there from the beginning, Indie for Indie backing you. Have the SNP made any moves towards you to say, we're getting behind this?
No. We have had word, sort of, how would you put it, third hand. Somebody might be quite interested in sitting down with you, and it's like, well, that would be very interesting as well. My feeling, I could be wrong, of course, but my feeling is, if I want to be generous to the Scottish government, I look at the fact that they're bound by the Scotland Act. And that's a very boring read, but I didn't, I put off reading it for a long time. But when I did read it properly, that's an eye-opener. I do know at least one lawyer believes that it's not actually lawful, that it's void because of the terms of the union. But what we know now, given that there are no terms of the union, which I'll get to later, I think they are bound by that. The administering power is the English state, calling itself the UK, and it passed the Scotland Act to allow devolution. And under that act, there really are they're hogtied body. They cannot do anything constitutional. So you would not expect the administration, the devolved administration, to get in touch with us. But the SNP is a party. There's no reason why they shouldn't do so. They have not so far. But I think it will not be up to us. It's not Salvo Liberation that needs to go chasing the parties. They need to talk to us, and that's down to the members, not to us.
But this is very constitutional. This is based on constitution.
Yes.
What better reason, Sara, to call a constitutional convention, if even to question the validity, excuse me, of what your group are proposing? Surely the SNP should be saying, well, at least it's worth a chat.
Of course, but I think we're looking at a political map, which, if we're honest, is an absolute mess. Just, politics depends on certain things being in place. Primarily it depends on voters. It depends on the electorate feeling engaged and feeling that this process is worthwhile and represents them and that they have a stake in it. When you have, I don't know that this is true or not because I haven't gone to check the figures, but I was told that at one of the recent by-elections, the voter turnout was 12%. I do know that previous by-elections we're looking at, they've been like 20%. I think there was one at 8.
That's about the average, yeah.
And so what that tells you is that the voters have disengaged. So, we can talk about Labour winning. That's not Labour winning, that's the whole system losing. It's that Labour can still get out enough of their vote, but everybody's given up. Now, when that happens, the whole basis that the political system stands on is gone. The electorate is no longer engaged. They've given up and gone home. So we're looking at, that's the first, big missing block in this whole notion of representative democracy. Not that I really think that's democracy. Then you have politicians scrabbling to get as many votes as they possibly can. And the problem with the system that we've got is that the parties looking to be in power are looking at their own position and their own funding and their own influence, and they're looking to get elected rather than looking at what they stand on. And we could take all of those. I mean, forget the damn Tories, but we could take, look at the SNP, and the SNP is all about getting Scotland's liberation, or that's where it comes from. That's where its home base is. Labour Party was all about social justice and equality, and blah blah. Well, can you see any sign of either of those things with either of those parties? What are they actually looking for? And not only are they concerned about just being in power for its own sake, which I think Robin McAlpin commented on this week, but they're also looking at keeping the really big players, the corporate players in the world, happy, and increasingly more concerned about that than they are about the electorate. So what we have is a perfect storm of popular disenfranchisement. And that's where we've got to approach independence, Scotland's position and what we want for Scotland, from the recognition of what they call the realpolitik that we're actually living in.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. They're averaging 20. I mean, it was a good one there last week. 25 was good. So the apathy party's winning every time.
Every time.
I mean, what we know is in July 24, it wasn't a big swing to Labour. 750,000 independent supporters stayed at home. And that's the people we've got to enthuse again. Now, that's the people that John Swinney's got to enthuse again. That's his big base. But they seem, as you say, they're more interested in power than actually their core, the raison d'etre of the party, which is supposed to be independence. So is there any way, what can be done, people watching, to get the SNP to engage, to at least have that conversation?
Well, a dear friend of mine and a good colleague of yours, Ian Lawson, used to say that we shouldn't worry about the politicians, because when they see traction and when they see movement and they see the people supporting that movement, they'll get on board and pretend they were in charge all along. He said, he had a terrific political wisdom about him, Ian. And I'm watching now, I'm watching what's happening. And, he was absolutely right. The number of people, so 2.5 years ago, when I was talking about this being a constitutional question, and the bottom line, this is prior to discovering that the union is a fiction, it doesn't exist. Prior to that, it was pretty clear to me, having looked very carefully at the constitutional question, and having I don't know what you'd call it, the Americans would say the chutzpah, to think I could be right and everybody else wrong. It was pretty obvious to me that if there was a union that had conditions, and there's a part in the preamble to the Treaty and Acts of Union that specifies a condition of the union and the treaty, which is this 1706 Act, of which the claim of right is the one named part, then Scotland had, as a condition of there being any union at all, a fact which, if you look at the Hansard records, you will see is regularly deferred to while it's ignored, Scotland retained the constitution articulated under the claim of right, which is not about religion. That's in there. It was put there by William the Orange Psycho, just as it was in the Bill of Rights in England. But it's an iteration, a protective iteration of Scotland's constitutional rights, or very largely is, which included, of course, the right to sack a government. So it was pretty obvious back then that either we were in the union with the right to sack a government or we were not, and so we were a colony. And that question needed to be answered. Since then, it has become clear, and we can prove, absolutely prove, that the UK that was supposed to come into effect, that was the treaties, this new state, new kingdom, single parliament, etc., never happened. It just simply didn't happen. And I can talk about that a bit more if you want later. So that no longer was the question about, well, if it applies or doesn't it apply. But back then, trying to put forward this idea that we had certain rights if we were in a union, and they are upheld and acknowledged within the British establishment under the Claim of Right Act. That was moon howling. That was nothing to do with anything. We were going to do this through a democratic process. The more I discovered, and there was at a time when there was absolutely no democratic process whatever by which we could, and the notion that well, if we're a colony, oh my God, moon howlers, nonsense. Well, I look at social media today, and somebody asked a simple question: do you accept that Scotland is a colony or not? On X, and I took a quick look at the answers straight away. I mean, within an hour, 63 people had replied with yes. 2.5 years ago, nobody would have known what you were talking about. So the movement that is happening, the awareness that is happening, Ian was quite right. This awareness is getting out there. We have put out enough that people have had enough exposure to be able to see what we're talking about, that Scotland is colonized, it's annexed, it's not a partner in a union, and that changes everything, because it means that you can't negotiate a divorce from a kidnapper. So Scotland's not an abused spouse in a marriage. Scotland's kidnapped, told it's a spouse, but it's got absolutely no rights because it's actually locked in, and everything that belongs to Scotland has been stolen by the kidnapper. And that's a whole different situation constitutionally. And so it always has been a constitutional issue. It has always been, we're not, you negotiate out of a union, a voluntary partnership. But if there's no such thing, then you need to know, well, we're up against this state that has actually lied, is covering up the fact that it has committed a crime in international law and is continuing to commit that crime in international law, has annexed Scotland, it has subject Scotland to a foreign sovereignty, it has pretended there's a partnership agreement. A state as ruthless and perfidious as that is not going to suddenly turn around and say, all right, you got me. Here, have your stuff back. And the notion that there was some democratic route out of that crime was always nonsense. So, we move to this point, and it is as we pick up that traction and as people start coming on board, and as it's really one of the things that's really warming is to see the reaction of international delegates or representatives when they understand Scotland's position, because they get it immediately, and and they're absolutely on what can we do, how can we help. People don't get it at home because we've been gaslit. We've been staring for so long at this kind of Orwellian proposition. Now, it might look like a colony, it might look like theft, it might look like oppression, it might look like we despise you, but actually this is a thriving, healthy partnership. Look at look at what our establishment says about it. Until people are willing to look at it raining and go, yep, the sun is shining. So that's the other exciting thing, is that the international community is much better educated, much better able to see what is.
Yeah, it's easier from outside looking in, isn't it, in
Aye.
any situation? But the other thing I've noticed and I know with senior SNP people I've spoken with, elected people, say, oh, this nonsense about Scotland being a colony has to stop, we're looking silly. You think, my God. But you, of course, with that famous phrase by Gandhi, first they ignore you. Well, there's been nothing in the mainstream media but this, absolutely zilch. Nothing in the a wee bit, I think a column in the National maybe, but not much. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then they lose. Now, you're being ignored just now. Very soon she's a nutter, Salvo's a nutter, this is nonsense, this is rubbish, and we're going to have people from the establishment with letters after their name and letters before their name telling us how this is just a load of nonsense by nutters. Are you prepared for that?
Yes. we've experienced that already from within our own movement until it stopped. And we have, when there has been anything published, and we have had the odd thing, we had a tiny bit of coverage when we did the Bonfire of the Vanities, which was a real kind of fun, tongue-in-cheek exercise with a serious message. And that, that got some coverage about this extreme radical fringe nut group in the Tory press. And then when we launched Liberation, got, sinister radical group, I think it was probably the Mail or something. The National has done a couple of things, both of which have been very cleverly slanted to make it look like we really are nutcases, not to be taken seriously. The guy that did the last one, Hamish Morrison, which wasn't, you look at it, it's not a takedown, but he finished it up with what happened to West Papua and how they were just thrown out, shown the door, even with the support they had, and then took it down 2 days later. But then, of course, the National's owned by the Herald, so we don't have any kind of independent press at all. I suspect that they will go on ignoring us. I think that we're ahead of the game in that we'll have announcements every so often, and we'll have another next month. I think that given who is supporting what we're saying, it will be harder. We haven't made that public yet, but it's going to be a lot harder to claim that we're nutcases, given that we've got a very reputable organization, NGO, convinced that we're going to win this, and that we have, although they did have press onto them, trying to get details, and then when they wouldn't give them any more than refer them back to Alf, they got on to Craig Murray looking for dirt on Justice Portu, the NGO. So they were, looking for some way to trash what we're doing. But what we're doing is, it's first of all, it's anything but fringe. It's absolutely legal, and it is following a fundamental human right. So we're doing something that is consistent with fundamental human rights and internationally lawful, and anything but fringe. That there has been no attempt by our establishment, Scottish political establishment, to really engage with the United Nations prior to this is just a crying shame.
Yeah, but there's two things. I mean, to reaffirm your point, Martin Geisler, and a word out to him, it's not often there's one of the British press and journalists, but he has been very constant when he said Starmer or Reeves or Sarwar or Russell Finlay or any of these unionists, he said to him, is this a voluntary union? And they, of course it is. And as soon as he says, well, then how does Scotland, if they want to? Oh no, people don't want to talk about that. They do become very uncomfortable when you go onto the Constitution. And one of the things I've always said, and we've been saying in Prism all the time, is that we can't win on British rules. If we play the British game, we will lose. We will continue to lose. The referendum that we had in 2014 was under British rules.
Yes.
And we cannot win under British rules, so we've got to be different. Now, one of the things that you're trying to do, and as part of it, and we'll come on to it, we do need an electoral mandate on it as well, event on it. What you're trying to do is get the most vital thing in any country becoming independent, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm sure if I have, you'll correct me, is international recognition.
Yes.
And that's exactly what you're going for here. You're not going to the ballot box. You're going to get international where they say, yes, you are a call. Our outcome, we hope, correct me again if I'm wrong, is that they say, yes, you meet the criteria, you've been treated like a colony, you're a colony, you deserve to have your say, they can't keep doing this, it is illegal. Am I right?
Correct. That's exactly right. And it's, so the thing the British state is really good at is flummery and gaslighting and, political kettling and so on. So we've had a legal establishment convinced, I was, Lloyd mentioned Neil McCormick on Prism Months. I used to work for Neil McCormick as when I was a producer, making kind of little electoral things for the SNP Euro group, and he became a friend, and I had immense affection and respect for Neil. And he was absolutely wrong. I didn't know that then. I do now. He was absolutely wrong. That line of thought from Dicey through Cooper and Smith, and that Neil picks up on, and the Scottish Lord Advocate talks about, where it's, this kingdom that came into existence and so on and so forth, it's wrong. But what, and but it's been accepted. It's what one KC that I'm talking to calls this orthodoxy. You can't get through that. Once you have an orthodoxy, it's like a fortress. You cannot get through it. And it's the same. Human beings are addicted to orthodoxy, whether it's religious or political or scientific, or legal. Once it's there, it's incredibly hard to knock it down. But this orthodoxy is wrong. But because of it, what we've had are proposals about, so if you look at the McCorkadale opinion, which is really good, it's a really good opinion, he talks about, he clarifies this fundamental right of peoples to self-determination. And he's right. He clarifies that Scotland meets that definition. It's absolutely clear that in terms of international law and international recognition, Scotland, the Scottish people, are a distinct people, and they merit that fundamental right to self-determination. And so that what we've been pushed towards is remedial secession, as though we have this treaty, we have this union, but we should be allowed to leave it because we've been treated so badly. What we're saying is we don't have the treaty, but I'll talk about that in a sec. So then you go round and round in circles. And if we were to go down that route, which is available, what would happen is that there is another set of rights and principles in international law, which is also fundamental. And that is the right of lawful sovereign states to integrity. And that's what you heard the Supreme Court talking about. The territorial and political integrity of the state. And nobody has the right to just rip that up. Now that set of rights sits directly against the rights, the fundamental rights of peoples, the component parts of the state. They have, those peoples, if they are distinct peoples, have that fundamental right, but then the state has the right to its integrity and its what would you call continuity. Historically, the United Nations has always gone with the continuity of the state. and the integrity of that state. So that this is where this whole constitutional business, this whole thing becomes a legal and constitutional matter. Because as you've said, independence is when you are recognized. Doesn't matter what you do at home, doesn't matter how much of your own affairs you're managing, you are an independent state when the international community recognizes you as a sovereign independent state and will now enter into trade agreements or treaties or a diplomacy with you as a state. That is what defines independence. So the question is, will that happen if Scotland, I know Peter Bell, talks about how we could just get UDI and repurpose Holyrood and get it to do this and so on and so forth. And, it doesn't really matter internationally. It absolutely matters. It absolutely matters that we are able to operate as an independent, to make our own laws, to rewrite agreements, to decide for ourselves, because nobody exists in isolation. Individuals don't, and countries don't. You have to be able to define yourself in relation to the rest of the world. So it's essential. That's what it is. That's what independence means. And that recognition depends on our being able to show the international community either that we have resolved the tension between the rights of this state, of the UK, to continuity and not to be torn apart, and that we've got agreement there, or, which is never going to happen, or show the truth, which is this state is England with Scotland annexed, Scotland retaining its crown, its boundaries, its distinct people, its history, its identity, but run under the foreign sovereignty that is an English crown and an English government. Yeah. So that there isn't a state to tear apart. There is a restoration that needs to take place. If we can do that, and that is the truth, if we can show that, then that tension between the rights of the states and the rights of peoples is somewhat resolved. You'd think it would be completely resolved, wouldn't you? But no, because this is, when it comes down to it, no matter what your legal case, no matter how just your position or how wrong what has been done is, international politics, international inverted commas law is pragmatic. It's going to be looking at what's the outcome. What is this going to do to the rest of the world? How is this going to affect us? The good news is that right now, Keir Starmer, and since Brexit, the UK has been becoming more and more unpopular internationally, and other countries are more and more.
I've got to say, it was never very popular with me at all.
It was not. Well, I don't think it was very popular in any of the former colonies, but there we go. We're soon to be a former colony.
But on that point you're talking about, we've discussed it often again in prison, and an example of use ferries, because people accept what they've been told, and our politicians have been told, by civil servants, this is the best way to build ships, and this is the type of ferries. And when I said, like, Valentine's along says, I can do it for a fraction of the cost and do it better, they go, oh no, I'll listen to the civil servant because he's been around the establishment for longer. And they ignore the experts. Now, we're coming in with experts now. If we get this opinion, I'm confident, but I'm always optimistic, Sarah. But I'm also pretty damn sure that the UK will ignore it, won't they?
The UK will, absolutely. That's why we're not taking it to the UK. We're not interested in what the UK has to say.
But they'll ignore what the UN say, won't they?
They will, but the thing is, there's only so much they can ignore. The UK, so the UN there are 17 remaining non-self-governing territories, which is colony to you and me. 10 of those are under UK administration. The UK is a problem, and the international community knows it. But it's as long as it's allied to big players and so on, it's dominated also. It has dominated the UN for years. And I had a really interesting conversation. I'm going off at a tangent a bit here, but I think this is really important. A few years ago, I had a really interesting conversation with Craig Murray, and he was talking about what was happening at the UN. We both, I'd been observing, that there was a resolution put to the General Assembly on support for the war in Ukraine, in the same way that a resolution was put for support of the invasion of Iraq. Now, there's not a huge time lapse between, 2002 and I think it was 2020. Anyway, so you're talking maybe just over a 10-year gap between these two resolutions. The Iraq one goes through, and it's absolutely appalling that it did. Mm-hmm. But the UN at that time was the UN at that time. The one on Ukraine did not. And the representative from the Global South who stood up and spoke against, gave the main argument against it, pointed out to the General Assembly, said, the United Nations was set up to broker peace, not to be a cheerleader for war. That would not have, that was the shift. That was the change. And it's really important to kind of understand this is happening. So I was talking to Craig about this, and he said, what has happened is post-colonial period, you had the sons and daughters of those who were as Alf will tell you, colonialism is always a collaborative venture, always. And then the colonists will point to the Vichy governments and the collaborators who they recruited to administer their colony, their empire, and say, here's the proof that you were part of it. You benefited. And they're pointing to a tiny profiteering class of traitors, saying that they represent the whole country and show that the country benefited. Well, then what happens is you get this aspiration over time to become the colonizer. So you have people who want to send their kids to Harrow and Eton and the English public schools, not Scottish ones, of course, because they know that British is English. And then they want them to go to Oxford and Cambridge. They want them to get into the elite of Anglo-British society. Their aspiration is to be as much like the colonizer as possible, to get away from their identity and become part of the club of the colonizer. And that had been what was happening. So the representatives going to the UN, in a lot of cases coming from these former colonies, still were coming from that class that aspired to become as much like the colonizer and be as much part of that as possible. That has changed, and it has changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years, and we're now seeing that shift taking place.
BRICS has had a lot to do with that.
BRICS has put the period on the sentence, as the Americans say, or the full stop on the sentence. But this was happening before BRICS, and I would say that it's more that BRICS is an expression of that. It's it's the next stage of that. The world beginning to shift into those who are still holding on to empire, and you can see them doing it, grabbing, clutching, and via the sort of corporate growth tumor that is now sitting on the world, versus those that are trying to shrug that off, and you can see real extraordinary movements. The alignment of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali in Africa at the moment, sending shockwaves through the French colonizer, colonial.
This is worrying me. I worry for those countries.
They've got Russia and China behind them, so that's that's a very different. This is a very different alignment. So you've got the chess game that we can all see, but then you've got the players behind it who are moving the chess pieces. I think we're all right to be a bit worried, Roddy. Yeah, but it's a good moment for Scotland.
Yeah, but we're getting to the stage where also we need to have, as we mentioned, an electoral event, and somehow I believe in them just shooting it with you, is that we have to have a united front, and I believe it should be a constitutional convention. I would love to see the SNP there. I know the ASP will be there. Indy for Indy will be there. Yeah, but these are small fry in real terms of the national movement. We need the entire national movement coming together and supporting a proper election in May 26.
Listen, what happens at the UN, and even if we, God forbid, we don't end up being listed for decolonisation, that awareness of Scotland's real position can't be taken. That jack in the box isn't going back in. So, we will have an international community far more aware of Scotland's position and aware that there's a crime has been and is being committed against Scotland. But what all of that does, which comes back to your original question, by the way, which I went off topic with, it doesn't, even if, when we get listing as a colony, all that does is it means that Westminster no longer has the option of holding that stick over Scotland's head, that sword of Damocles. You'd never get international recognition, you wouldn't get independence because you'd have done this unlawfully. That's no longer there. Not only that, but under international law, we can go ahead and have any democratic event that we want to organise without Westminster interference, let alone permission. So what we're really talking about is taking the stranglehold of Scotland's neck and saying, all right, guys, now we're free to do whatever we choose to do as a people. So all you're really doing is handing that right back to the people.
But you need political will for that, don't you, Sarah?
You absolutely do. But so this comes right back to what we were talking about before, which is the fact that we have a completely disengaged electorate. They are scunnered, to use a good Scottish word, with the whole shower. They've had it. They've seen what politics means. They've seen there's no accountability. They're powerless. Go out and give us your vote, and that's the end of it. Then we'll do what we want. People have given up. So we have to address that. So we have this freedom now. We get this freedom to do something that can deliver Scottish independence, but we've got an entirely disenfranchised electorate. So what do we do? Also, there are other constitutional things that need to come into play. So the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah.
This is so much more important than most people realize. It's not just that we have to have a kind of, some kind of coordination, because when we leave when we escape the kidnappers' clutches, we're going to have to put back everything that should be in place in Scotland. We're going to have to, we've got to organise. We've got to, what about that? How do we take back what belongs to us? How do we get how do we get rid of the backdoor shares that the English state has taken in our oil and gas? How do we, there's lots and lots of things that have to be addressed. You must have a convention. There's one really important reason why it has to be put in place as soon as possible. And it's why we have a recall of the Convention of Estates in the Edinburgh Proclamation that you sign up to when you join Liberation. That is, Holyrood cannot, under any circumstances, ever, in any world whatsoever, declare independence. It cannot be repurposed to do that. It cannot be voted to be repurposed to do that. And the reason for that, if you will read is there in the Kosovo ruling. It's there when you see the submission of Yugoslavia to the ICJ, arguing that the representatives who had been elected under a franchise, under a vote held by the state. And therefore, their declaration of independence wasn't lawful. And the reason they say this is, in Scotland's case, what this means is Holyrood is the arm of the body that is Westminster constitutionally. It is governed under the Scotland Act, under Westminster constitutionally. The arm cannot cut itself off from the body. It cannot do that. it's an extension of the state. A state can't mutilate itself legally. So what the Kosovan representatives did was they stood on independence, but they joined a civic convention once they were elected. They did not take their seats in that parliament. They had the democratic mandate because they had been elected, but they did not take their seats.
But that was in 1919 or 1918. The Sinn Féin got elected, didn't take up their seats, but they immediately went to Dublin and had opened the Dáil and declared their independence inside the Dáil. Is that what you say we would need to do? We would need to win the Holyrood election and go to the Royal High School, for example, and declare our UDI. Is that what you're saying?
It would not. If we have done our job so that the international community understands Scotland's position and has recognised that we have the right to terminate the colonial situation that we're in, that we're not disrupting a state, we're restoring the proper boundaries, then it's not so much, it's no longer really UDI. I mean, I suppose it is, because you're declaring independence without any agreement from Westminster, but a colonised people can only ever really declare UDI. They can only, because the colonizer never lets go, unless it absolutely has to. So, you know, what we're talking about is what is the process that would be internationally recognised as lawful. And the process that would be internationally recognised as lawful is that we would have this convention, the civic assembly already in place. And then with that democratic mandate, the representatives joining it, as you say, then maybe the Royal, High School, they say, yeah, we've got the mandate for independence, we're now declaring Scotland independent. And internationally, that's, yeah, we've had the democratic event, we're now proceeding on that. The preferred route at the UN is a referendum, but that doesn't exclude the notion of a clear plebiscite. So it's absolutely doable, so long as it has already been recognised that we wouldn't be tearing a state apart here. We'd be ending a crime.
Right, so let me ask you this. If, unfortunately, the wheels of justice never move quick, it could be a while before the UN comes to its decision. It could be after the 26th election. But let's just imagine we get unity of the independence movement, and come May 26, we get 51% of the votes cast, and we get 51% of the seats up for grabs. Are you saying we couldn't at that point, if we've been in a single line manifesto saying a vote for me is a vote for independence, and they get elected, are you saying we couldn't then declare independence?
No, we could, so long as, so here's that, for the 77th Brigade who are going to be watching this, here's the poke in your eye. As long as we have an international community that is aware and has understood Scotland's position, even if there's blithering around, that declaration would be considered. It would not be thrown out, because there would be too many countries going, well, hang on, Scotland's doing what Scotland has a right to do. It wouldn't be as cut and dried as if we had already got listing for decolonisation, which I am hoping we will have.
Yep.
But it would still be there, because all any of this means is, people think in terms, very black and white terms. I used to think in very black and white terms about how international law works and moves and international politics work. But in point of fact, the lines are much more blurred than you would imagine. So what this is all about is, does the General Assembly, in other words, does the international community as a whole recognise that Scotland has been colonised? If so, then Scotland needs to be listed for decolonisation. That isn't a process, by the way, that the UK can veto. It doesn't have a veto on that. If the General Assembly voted to recognise Scotland prior to listing for decolonisation, prior to that official, benediction, that would be blocked by the UK, and thus prove that our point was correct. We're a colony. But even so, what that would mean is that it would end up, in a big kind of fight at the United Nations, and it just means it would be a longer fight, but we'd win it because it would be very clear that the democratic will of the Scottish people was to be independent of the foreign state, and that is a fundamental in international law.
Can I be the devil's advocate for a moment?
Yeah.
If we look at the ICC decision, a UN court, which is the United Nations court on Netanyahu, and they get sanctioned by the Americans and it gets ignored. If we look at the Chagos Island, where the UN said, yes, that's to go back to the Chagos Islanders should get their land back, the UK and US have ignored that. What's to stop them ignoring this ruling when we win it?
They will ignore it. But the thing is, our position is different in that the only power they have had over us is that we would not have international recognition if we held a referendum, what they called a wildcat referendum, without their permission.
Yeah.
Once that's out of the way, then what are they going to do if we say, okay, we've had our democratic event, we've declared independence, we're recognized by the international community? What are they going to do? We then do it. We have the infrastructure. We're not in the same kind of position as many of these former colonies that, people who, you look at the Chagos Islands, those people were thrown off their lands.
Yeah.
Thrown off their lands, and they're it's a tiny population, and they have no backing. They have no real agency. So the UK has got away with doing it for doing what it's doing, and the UN can't force anybody to do anything. They can't enforce international law on genocide. But what they can do is they can make an acknowledgement that gives us the ability to do what we are capable of doing. And that's why you're right. We have to have this unity, because we have to have.
If the 60 countries that have left the Union, left the British Empire, were to recognise us along with a dozen of the BRICS countries, it would be very difficult then for the British to hold on to us, wouldn't it?
Well, what would they do? Take us to the international court and lose? I mean, what are they going to do?
Send in the soldiers?
Yeah, now there's that. But then, we're now in a position where, well, hang on a minute, there's Russia, China, they're not inclined to sit back and let that kind of thing happen, as we're seeing. So, they might, but I suspect that they wouldn't, because I suspect, as I say, the people playing chess around the edges would have something to say about that. So, and the reason I suspect that, Roddy, is because the British state has relied on lies. It has relied on people believing fictions to maintain its hold. And those fictions are actually a house of cards. And they wouldn't have done so if they didn't with the Chagos Islands. They haven't with their other former colonies or colonies. Yes, they told lies. They always do, but they haven't relied on them. That hasn't been the main kind of defense against losing that colony. In Scotland's case, they constructed a fiction, a really extraordinary fiction. Speaking out of my students in America used to talk about talking out of both sides of your mouth. And so at the same time as talking about a voluntary partnership, and you're a voluntary partner, which means something very specific, by the way, they have insisted that Scotland has absolutely no rights at all. At the same time as talking about how we benefit from this union, that they've robbed us blind and claimed that the treaty is there, while in plain sight, there's the claim of right. It's a fundamental constitutional document. And when when Blackford introduced that vote in the House of Commons based on the 1989 reiteration of the claim of right, that this House acknowledges that the people of Scotland are sovereign with the right to determine the form of government best suited to their needs, there wasn't a single vote against it. but they made sure nobody turned up, not enough people turned up for that to be a binding resolution. That's because they know, and they're terrified, that they're pretending this union is still there, and if the claim of right is not acknowledged, it's a condition of the union, but at the same time, it's not there. And they made up this, Scotland entered the nation, Scotland is a nation that entered the union as a voluntary partner and not as a dependency in 1954, signed by the Queen, signed off by both houses of Parliament, to show the international community that Scotland's not a colony. It's complete fiction. It's an absolute fiction. All our lawyers have bought into that fiction, that this new state.
What date was that they put that?
1954, the Royal Commission on
54.
Scottish Affairs.
54.
Yeah. Presented to the House of Commons and Lords and to the Queen in 1954. So, this is a fiction that Neil McCormack bought into, and Lord Cooper bought into, and our current legal establishment mostly buys into. And it never happened, because the treaty is very clear. There is to be a new kingdom, a single kingdom. The two former kingdoms are extinguished and the new kingdom is formed. It didn't happen. A kingdom is the territorial jurisdiction of a crown, and the crowns of Scotland and England both remain. Scotland was added to the English crown. Scottish Parliament was abolished, not adjourned. The English Parliament continued. So we did not have a new state.
Yeah, in the referendum campaign, I don't know if you remember, but David Mundell, who was then the Secretary of State for Scotland, mentioned that we had been expunged in 1707, that Scotland no longer existed. So they've said that that's in Hansard.
Yeah.
They've admitted that they wiped us out.
Yeah. That was the purpose. That was so we had a treaty, we signed a treaty. That's your voluntary partnership. That's what they're talking about. The treaty is inoperative. It never came into existence. We were annexed, added to an English crown. Our Scottish crown still remains, but it's kind of dormant because it sits under, just as if Edward I had one, sits under the English crown. And we were treated, we became a colony. We were allowed, just like the Irish, we were allowed to have representatives in the English Parliament, as Defoe said, to sit there and be laughed at.
Yeah.
But that is a colony. That is the definition of a colony. And Alf has shown, and our colonial markers illustrate, that in every respect, Scotland matches the features of a colonised people. So that is what the British state has been at pains to hide. Because once that's out, and that's, that genie is out of the bottle, it can't go back in. Mm-hmm. And it means that the UK state is in violation of its obligations to transmit the information about its dependencies. It means that it's in violation of international law in terms of having a colony. It means that it has represented itself, when it represented Scotland as a voluntary partner in the creation of this state, this union with this new state coming into being. It not only misrepresented Scotland, it misrepresented itself, because what is prancing around on the world stage calling itself the United Kingdom, formed through a single transformational constitutional event in 1707, is actually just England from 1066. That's what British means, to the present, with Scotland added, like every other colony, to the English domains, to the English crown, under the rule of an English Parliament. It has misrepresented itself to the entire world. There is no such creature as the United Kingdom. It is just England pretending to be something else. And that is pretty big as well. So you can understand why they wouldn't really want that, would you, 77th lot, exposed on the world stage. So that's why I look at this and I go, sometimes truth really will set you free. We don't, we can't and shouldn't expect the United Nations to do anything more than support and help. And if there were a referendum, to make sure that it's an absolutely fair referendum. But recognizing that Scotland has the right to take our self-determination into our own hands, that's what the British state has been trying to avoid for the past 70-odd years.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons we lost, one of the main reasons we lost the referendum, in my humble opinion, is because we didn't control the narrative. Westminster controlled the narrative. We fought it on their lines. We fought it on British subjects, about wages, about jobs, about EU. We were on their ground. But correct me if I'm wrong, but here, if we control the narrative, which we would do if we go into this election in 26, we make the narrative about our case at the UN, about the unity, about a constitutional convention. We're fighting on our ground, in our country, with our electorate, and we control the narrative, not Westminster. Am I right?
Look, 100%. There are two or three things we didn't control. We didn't control the media, and in a constitutional referendum, there's supposed to be absolutely scrupulous, fair, even-handedness. We did not control the franchise, and there's no country in the world in which a constitutional referendum on the future of that country is decided by temporary workers, temporary students, second homeowners, people who've been there 5 minutes, people with no stake in the future of that country. That is an absurdity, and it always was. And those that argued for it really need to go and hang their heads in shame. They were fooled by the British establishment into buying that. And we didn't control the terms. Sorry, that's my late mother's clock. I haven't had the heart to get rid of.
Our enemies watching that can use a cuckoo clock. How appropriate those things.
I'm sure they will, but I have got very used to that. So have at it. So that has completely knocked me off.
The cuckoo's thrown you out. They did the exact same to me.
Our narrative. We were talking about the narrative and what we control.
Yeah, the narrative. Absolutely.
We couldn't even control the terms of the Edinburgh Agreement, so that we had supposed to have this purdah period during which no new policies could be announced.
Correct,
and yet we had the vow. I think it was within a day or 2 days of the actual vote. And then they said, "Oh, it didn't alter anything." It didn't alter anything. I mean, really? Yeah. And on top of that, I know people don't want to talk about vote rigging, but I did. I used to work as an investigative journalist, and I did some pretty heavy digging into that. Let me tell you, there is very good reason to doubt the result of that referendum. And that is control too. Control of the ballot, control, proper control of the integrity, the chain of what do you call that? The kind of chain of defense from the printing of the ballots to the electoral roll to the thing. You have to have that. You have to look at that. A democracy is not maintained by saying it couldn't happen here. It's maintained by taking it apart, looking at where the weak points are and how you close the holes in the system to make sure that no fraud could ever take place. And that is normal behavior. We didn't have that either. So
perfidious Albion.
Mm-hmm. So you're absolutely right. It's control on all of those levels, and the narrative absolutely has to be our narrative. But it's much like, as you said before, playing Westminster's game, trying to beat Westminster on its playing field with its team, that is massively greater than ours, changing the rules as it sees fit. That's a mug's game. Yeah. So we need to play on our own playing field, and it needs to be by our rules. And one of the rules, as I said, when you sign the Edinburgh Proclamation, one of the things you're signing up to is the creation of a modern convention of estates. Now, the reason for that is what we were just talking about, that Holyrood can never, under any circumstances or in any world, declare Scotland independent. It has to be a civic assembly. Much like Kosovo, that would have to be in place, and the representatives with their mandates join that. And that's, by the way, what the ICJ said. They were happy that those delegates had not joined the state apparatus. They had then joined the civic convention. They had the mandate, and they could declare independence. So that's how we know that that's the process. But Scotland, having been annexed, and actually whether we were in the union or not, given that the claim of right would be a precondition of that union, and it remains common law to this day, a provision of Scotland is it had three parliaments that did different things. The Borough Assembly was known as a parliament. What we think of the parliament, the three estates that passed the legislation, and the Convention of Estates, which had done, it had a name change. It was previously the General Council up until the 1500s, I think, and then it changed its name because convention became a much more fashionable term. So it was called when a parliament could not be called. The Claim of Right was passed not by the three estates, what we think of as a parliament, but by the Convention of Estates, because James had abdicated, or had left, he'd run away, so he couldn't call the parliament. And in Scotland, as in England, the legislative parliament had to be summoned by the monarch. So if there wasn't a monarch, it couldn't be summoned. That, by the way, is why the Bill of Rights in England is still the Bill of Rights, not an act, because there was no monarch to convene the parliament. It was passed by a convention. In Scotland, because we had a provision that if we couldn't have a parliament called by the monarch, the Convention of Estates, or General Council as it could step in, it did. So the Claim of Right was passed by the constitutional provision for an assembly in Scotland when you can't call your own parliament. And that's still in place, Roddy. That is, the international community would recognise that. All we need is one decent lawyer to set that out. And that would be recognised, that was being summoned as the interim, when we can't call a legislative parliament. So that's why it's in there, because we're going to need it, and to give it as much in the way of teeth as we possibly can in order to declare independence. So we're thinking ahead, thinking, how do we get this? How do we declare independence? Yeah. That's, and if our politicians are not getting on board with that, and they're not, because they're busy hedging their own bets and thinking about their own nests and so on and so forth, then the people are going to have to do it. And you know what? That might be a great thing, because it's time to think differently politically. If we're going to have direct democracy, parties are not going to matter. Indie for Indie, ISP that's already committed to that. People that are happy to hand the power back to the people and to become genuinely the servants of the people have to be the way we go. And we have to get the electorate thinking differently. We have to, think of it this way. As awful as it is that people have given up voting under the current system, it is an opportunity to say to our own people, how about doing this differently? Let's do this a different way. Mm-hmm. And that's where, if we can get that message across and seriously have people voting for Scotland and not for parties. Yeah.
Look, the clock is beating us as always it does, Sarah. I want to thank you very much for being here, and once again congratulate you for the effort you put in. And I would just say to those watching, if you haven't already joined Salvo Liberation, the time is to do it now to show your support, because it's important that we send that message out. And you'll notice we were talking about the Constitution. I would say to you now, when you encounter unionists, ask them, is this a voluntary union? And then when they say, of course it is, ask them blatantly, right? So how does Scotland leave that voluntary union, and watch them crumble? Keep the pressure on them. Don't go on to talk about the things they want to talk about. Oh, it's about jobs, it's about this. Don't do it. Stick with what we're strong on. The Constitution is our way of getting out of this, and getting out of this bloody union.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it. There'll be lots more to come on this. There's lots of ideas with lots of people floating about, folks, but what we need is unity. If you're in Alapa or you're in SNP, you've got to put pressure on your parties to join for independence, not for power, but for the country, for independence. The rest is peripheral. We need unity. Keep pressing, folks, and keep safe till we see you again. Take care now.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.